Jill Valentine, one of the most beloved and well-known characters in Resident Evil. This is a character that throughout the series has played a major role, especially in the original trilogy, where in Resident Evil 1, she is one of the main characters alongside Chris Redfield, and in Resident Evil 3, she is the sole main character in that game. So she has played a huge role throughout the series, but one thing I have asked myself for a while, and am wondering is, when are we going to see Jill make a return comeback in the series? You know, we haven't seen Jill in the main timeline, a game that takes place in the current timeline since Resident Evil 5, and that took place in 2009. In that game, she's under the control of Albert Wesker, and Chris and Sheva have to free her of that control. Once they do that and Resident Evil 5 is resolved, Wesker is defeated, what happens to Jill is she gets put in rehab and testing. We learn this in Revelations 2 when we find a letter that Jill wrote to Barry, and it talks about where she's saying how she's been through so much testing and now she's about to start her rehab, but that she's just really looking forward to eventually getting back to the BSAA and going back on the front lines because she's so tired of being in a lab all the time. And that's pretty much the last thing that we ever heard about Jill was that letter. And the last time we saw her in a main timeline game was in Resident Evil 5. And the reason I put so much emphasis on main timeline is because we have seen her in other games, like in Revelations 1. She was in that game. She was the main character of that game. However, that game takes place in 2005, a few years before Resident Evil 5. So that was more of a flashback sort of game that's like, this is what's happening before those events of 5, but this is also what happens after 4. That's what Revelations 1 was. And she also, of course, got the recently released Resident Evil 3 Remake that came out a couple months ago, but that's a remake of an older game that takes place in the 90s, in 1998. So that also isn't a current, timeline game. So Resident Evil 5 was the last game where that was actually a thing. And so I'm hoping that we eventually do get Jill. I hope that we eventually do get to see this character in a current timeline game again as either a side character or the main character, preferably the main character, because she's just such a major character that I feel like they should really bring her back as a main character in a numbered series and let her have her shining moment again, because it's really unfortunate that we haven't seen her that much as we have other characters, particularly Chris and Leon. They've been used a ton. Other characters have kind of had to sit out, and it's kind of unfortunate, but still, that's just one thing I'm hoping for. I know way back when Vendetta had came out, there were rumors about the 4th CG film starring Jill and Helena, but I have yet to hear anything else about that, so that rumor may not be true. I wish it were, because 1, we'd get to see Jill again, which would be really awesome, and 2, it'd bring back Helena from Resident Evil 6, which would also be great, because it would show that Helena would not be a one-hit wonder, which is something I'm always worried about whenever they introduce new characters is, are we going to see these characters again? I'm still wondering if we'll ever see Billy, or if we'll ever see Carlos again, or Sheva, Jake. Will we ever see these characters again? Mora from Revelations 2 is another one. There's just a lot of characters that I'm wondering if we'll ever see them again, or are they going to be left, as one-hit wonders or two-hit wonders or whatever. So I'm hoping Jill doesn't fall into that category of forgotten characters. Hopefully she continues to get new games that, are in the current flow of time and not just remakes and games that take place, 5 or 10 years ago. Hopefully she gets a current game. Resident Evil 8 would be a perfect game to reintroduce her. We already have Chris Redfield confirmed, so what if Jill makes an appearance in this game? What if Chris has gone completely rogue, maybe working with Umbrella has started to get to his head, and maybe he's kind of got like a Injustice Superman vibe going on, where he's taking out anyone and everyone who poses even the slightest threat. And so maybe Jill steps in and she has to knock some sense in his head, similar to what Pierce did in Resident Evil 6, where, you know, Chris in Resident Evil 6 basically lost all, you know, drive. He lost all, you know, sense of, you know, fighting this virus and everything after losing his men. And so he just left it. He got amnesia or whatever it was. He lost his memory, and it was just really bad. And Pierce had to come in and kind of push him back to, being the character that he always was. Maybe Jill has to do that again, but instead of, you know, Chris leaving it all behind and drinking it away and losing his memory, this time he's just gone, you know, berserk, and he's taken out everyone, you know, even if it isn't justified. So maybe that's what Jill does, or maybe Jill's in this game is just another character that's out in this village and castle area, and she's, you know, a playable character maybe, or maybe she's just a side character like she was in Resident Evil 5, and maybe potentially get some DLC like she did in Lost in Nightmares. Maybe that's something that will happen, but regardless, I'm just really hoping that we get to see Jill back again in a current game that takes place in, you know, 2020 or something like that, because, you know, 2009 was 11 years ago. So you would think by now she's had enough time to be in rehab and to have recovered, and she's ready to go, because, I mean, heck, in her letter to Barry, she was talking about how she was ready to be back on the BSAA and front lines and all this stuff. And that's been a while ago, because Revelations 2 takes place before 6. And Resident Evil 6 is in 2012, so that means Resident Evil Revelations happened several years ago, so you know Jill's got to be ready to go back on the front lines by now. So I'm hoping Capcom does show her off. They've already got the character model for her because of Resident Evil 3 Remake. You just got to make the character model look 20 years older, and there you go. Bam, she's ready for Resident Evil 8. There you go. So I'm really hoping that happens. On top of that, I think Capcom released a survey of questions on, like, what they are, you know, what the fans want, what the fans think about Resident Evil 8. And if I'm not mistaken, because I did take the survey, I think one of the questions was, do you hope to see more familiar characters in Resident Evil 8? I think that's what it said. It may have said for future Resident Evil games, but I think it was specifically talking about Resident Evil 8. And if that's the case, that might be some shining light for a potential return for Jill, or even, you know, one of the other characters that I listed off earlier in this video. Maybe they come back. Maybe one of them shows up. So, I don't know. I just want to make a video talking about Jill, because I just think it's really strange how she's such a major character, yet they haven't done a lot with her. She's just kind of been on the sideline, except for a few games that took place in the past, and that's about all she's gotten. So fingers crossed that they actually give Jill, you know, some actual, you know, current events and not just flashback events and things like that. So I'm going to end this video here, and I'll see you all in the next one. See you then.
You saved me!
Yeah.
That was close. Thanks, Barry.
Don't mention it. What a monster. I can't believe... What the hell is this place anyway?